I'm Bill Roebuck, Executive Vice President at the Arab Gulf States Institute. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to our program today, assessing the ongoing military conflict between Israel and Iran. Israeli attacks on Iran began June 13 with precision strikes, targeted assassinations, as well as attacks on nuclear facilities, air bases, and ballistic missile launchers. The Israeli attacks and Iran's response with ballistic missiles and drones have now continued into the fourth day. Today's panel will examine the objectives and calculations of Iran, Israel, the Arab Gulf states, and the United States, and analyze their reactions to the conflict thus far. The panelists will also assess where this live wire conflict could be headed, the diplomatic off-ramps available, the risks involved, and the ways the various parties are likely to try to shape an evolving U.S. response. So let's get started as I introduce our panel. Ali Alfoneh is a senior fellow at AGSI. He focuses on Iran and puts out twice weekly our Iran Media Review. Kristin Diwan is a senior resident scholar at AGSI. Her current projects focus on generational change, nationalism, and the evolution of Islamism in the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Robin Mills is a non-resident fellow at AGSI and is the CEO of Qamar Energy. He is an expert on energy strategy and economics. Hussein Ibish is our moderator today. Hussein is a senior resident scholar at AGSI. Hussein, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our guests online and everyone who's tuning in. And thank you for joining us today. Another great webinar, very timely one from AGSI. Thanks to Ambassador Roebuck for that. And we've had the introduction of our tremendous panel here, which is all in-house at AGSI. So I'm very delighted and proud and honored to be part of that. I'll be moderating. What I'll be doing is throwing out questions to the panelists individually and as a group. And I'll be entertaining your questions as well on the Q&A function. You can ask them anytime. I'll be reminding you in the audience to send them in a little later on in the course of our conversation. But I think we need to start at the beginning. Habemos bellum, right? We've got a war, and this is the real thing. This is not just a tit for tat exchange. This is a full-blown conflict. There's no mechanized front line or series of front lines as was there during the Iran-Iraq war or between Russia and Ukraine. But you do have the kind of war of the cities, which was there in the Iran-Iraq war, and again between Russia and Ukraine, where both sides are striking each other remotely and at a distance. I don't think there's much chance of a full-blown mechanized battlefield, between infantry units on both sides. So this is going to be resolved in the air, and that makes it quite a remarkable war. But I'm trying to stress here that this is a full-blown war, no matter how you want to slice it. This is not a skirmish. This is not a test run. This is not a limited exchange. This is a war. So I'd like to begin by asking our panelists the biggest sort of 30,000-foot question, which is, where do you think we are right now in this? What are the Israelis thinking in your view? What are the Iranians thinking in your view? And I'll try to be specific with each of you, and I'm going to begin with Ali. Iran was attacked. I think Israel's motivations are less unclear than the situation Iran has been unwillingly thrust into. So how do you think the Iranian regime perceives its situation right now? What do you think it believes is happening to it, and how do you think it's looking to respond in the immediate term? That is to say, within the next 24 to 48 hours or so. And I'll just start you off with that, and then I'll go to our other two panelists, Kristin and Robin.
Uh, Hussein, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for providing me with this opportunity to share my analysis with you and with our audience. President Trump came into office with a grand vision of peace, peace in Ukraine, peace in Gaza, and peace with Iran. But unfortunately, in every single of these theaters of war, he has been met with attempts of active sabotage, sabotage by both the Ukrainian and Russian leadership of his peace plan for Ukraine, sabotage of his Gaza peace plan by Hamas and by Prime Minister Netanyahu. But in the case of Iran, Iran and the United States were engaged in negotiations. In the case of Iran, it was not Iran sabotaging the talks, but the Prime Minister of Israel, who believed that an agreement, a negotiated solution between the United States of America and Iran over Iran's nuclear program would constitute a problem and a threat to Israel. This is why he sabotaged.
We'll talk about the proximate cause of that in a minute. Yeah, but go ahead.
And he also, the Israeli Prime Minister also appears to hope that he can provoke Iran to engage in overreaction, which would involve Iran in a direct war with the United States of America. In other words, he is trying to make the United States fight another war in the Middle East, one of those forever wars that President Trump himself has warned against. So here we have Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel as being the prime saboteur. As for Iran's responses, until now, Iran has acted against Israel. In other words, tit for tat attacks. But unfortunately for Iranians, they cannot answer and respond to Israeli threats and Israeli actions on the ground in Iran at the same level. Iran appears to be completely penetrated by Israeli intelligence agents. There are acts of sabotage and also terrorism, car bombs taking place in the streets of Tehran. And Iran's only response right now has been limited because it is incapable of launching the number of missiles they were hoping to launch. Iran's original response plan was 1,000 missiles launched against Israel on day one of the war. But Israel, because of the preemptive nature of its strike, managed to take out many of the launchers. And Iran's response has been limited to 200 missiles per day, which is more or less manageable from an Israeli perspective, and the multi-layered air defense systems of Israel. So what is the next move? If the Iranian leadership believes that it is facing an existential threat, and if the Iranian leadership also experiences that there will be more cases of high-level assassination with the aim of bringing down not just the nuclear program, but the regime in its entirety, and perhaps even provoke a civil war in Iran, then Iran may respond by attacking energy sector and energy infrastructure in the Persian Gulf region, which is going to involve the Arab countries. And in doing so, Iran would be hoping to create an international pressure against Israel to stop bombing Iran. But obviously, the risk is that such an action would bring in the United States actively into the conflict. And this is the dilemma that the Iranian leadership is facing.
I'm going to thank you for that, Ali. I'm going to get to my own sense of the Israeli motivation a bit later, but I want to turn to Kristin now to ask about the reaction of the Gulf Arab countries and how do they see? I mean, obviously, it's not a unified response. There are 6 countries with 6 different perspectives and 6 different realities, very different. But how do you read their responses and where do they see themselves fitting in? I think they would all agree that this is a really bad thing, but to a different extent and in different ways. So can you tell us about how you read the Gulf responses?
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think the Gulf states are quite literally stuck in the middle of this war. I think it's a war that's been much predicted. I mean, we can think about it for over a decade. I mean, we've really seen Iran emerge as the main strategic competitor to Israel. We know that Israel wants to keep strategic dominance and military dominance over the rest of the region. And, Iran is the one state that has the ability to perhaps get a nuclear weapon. And also has sort of the strategic depth to be a real challenger to Israel. So I think that tension has been there for quite some time. And I think now, especially after October 7th and the attack on Israel, they're not going to really allow. There's kind of more of an idea that they need to really act on a lot of what they see as these challenges against them. I think the Gulf states have been on a bit of a path over the last 2 decades on how they center themselves within this strategic competition. We all know historically King Abdullah, previous king of Saudi Arabia, called for the U.S. to chop the head of the snake. I think that's what he said, to really go after Iran. And we know that they have also seen Iran as a deeply problematic state, and particularly the Islamic Republic as a problematic regime that has intervened in very destabilizing ways in their own countries. But I think they've been on a path of shifting their posture a bit towards this conflict. If we do look at the way that they responded, they all uniformly condemned the Israeli attack. We've seen a lot of interaction amongst the foreign ministers, a lot of diplomatic back and forth to coordinate their positions, and also to speak directly with the Iranian foreign minister, also reaching out to the United States. So I think it's pretty clear that there's a uniform posture of trying to de-escalate this conflict. We can talk about the reason for this shift, and there's really a couple key things that go behind that. I think the main thing for me is when we look at the overall strategic picture in the region, in the Gulf region, there's been a real sense, especially since the attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities in 2018, I believe it was, on Upcake in
2019. September 2019, yeah.
Thank you. That basically that they were potentially, well, literally targets. We know that Iran has specifically threatened the Gulf states that if they were attacked, that they would go after Gulf states or go after U.S. forces, which many of them are in the Gulf states as well. So they really are literally stuck in the middle of this conflict. But I think it also goes beyond that threat. And I think this is where we could have some debate, and I'm sure the debate is out there. I think a lot of people see it as simply that they feel threatened, so that they're going to condemn this action. But in reality, they're really happy to see Iran, their military prowess and stuff in the Islamic State Republic kind of brought down a size. I'm not 100% sure about that, because the threat still definitely very much remains. There's a lot of uncertainty about the way that this conflict could go, in ways that it could be quite devastating for the Gulf states. But in addition, I think basically since that time, when they realized that the United States wasn't necessarily going to be there for them in the way that they thought, protecting them, there's been a real regionalization of how people look at the region, and they've been trying to figure out a way to secure themselves within the region. And maybe I'll stop here and not go into detail on that, but I think that's where we get into some differences amongst the Gulf states and how they see that and their different strategies. But I think on the whole, that strategy has meant really de-escalating with Iran and not wanting to tackle them and be in opposition to them directly.
Before we go to Robin, I'd like to ask you a follow-up. The Iran's strategic position has greatly weakened over the course of last year, in 2024. And in particular, the loss of their only state-level ally in the Arab world, Bashar al-Assad's Syria. The Turkish-engineered downfall of al-Assad was the sort of crowning catastrophe in the annus horribilis for Iran, the atrocious year of 2024. To what extent do you think the Gulf countries, in addition to all the broader changes over perhaps a decade or something, with the great inflection point of upended and coalesce, changing their attitude towards Iran and the United States and where they fit into that whole nexus? In addition, how much do you think that the apparent weakening of Iran strategically and the strategic threat posed by the axis of resistance, so-called, weakened by Israel, and then without the linchpin of al-Assad, is factoring into their view of Israel's actions here?
Well, I think it's a huge factor, and that goes back to the way that they're calculating their security in a region where, again, they're not depending as much on the United States, or not to the degree that they used to. They need to figure out who are the biggest threats in the region and how they're going to respond to those threats. Obviously, I think in previous years, they saw Iran as the biggest threat. I think now with Iran degraded, there's a sense that it is less of a threat. And there is a lot of worry about Israel emerging as a destabilizing force in the region. I mean, we've seen Israel, obviously, they've taken out Hezbollah. They still have a presence in Lebanon. They've now taken up a presence as well in Syria in a way that many perceived as being destabilizing potentially there. Now they're showing, at least today, we're saying that they have freedom of movement over the skies in Iran. So I think actually we have to think about that, the way that the Gulf states see this emerging balance or imbalance, and where they can position themselves best. Mostly their big goal is to have stability so that they can proceed with their huge transformation and economic plans and the globalization that they want to do, being really a global hub. But also just their security too within this environment. And I think that's where we get a little bit of differences in how the different states situate themselves amongst these big players, amongst Iran, which is still considered a big player, Israel, and we could probably throw Turkey in there as well.
Oh, I think so, and the United States, of course. I think that's right. We'll explore all of that in a lot more detail over the course of this conversation. But I'd like to bring Robin in at this point. So we've had references, both Ali and Kristin, to threats posed to the oil infrastructure, especially in Iran, and the potential threat to Gulf Arab countries' infrastructure as well. And we saw attacks presumably by Iran on Saudi Aramco in 2019, and in January of 2020 by the Houthis on the Emirati, oil infrastructure just north of Abu Dhabi, which killed several oil workers, expatriate oil workers. So what do you think this does? So, I mean, from a kind of a global perspective, the biggest concern is what this kind of conflict would do to energy availability and energy pricing, the threat it poses economically to the world, and to the energy production and distribution from these crucially important energy exporters, not forgetting Qatar's LNG. So what do you think about that? How's the world looking at this, and how does it look regionally and globally?
Thank you, Hussein. So, look, I think it's pretty notable. So far, the Israelis have gone after domestic energy targets in Iran, right? They've attacked 2 gas processing plants, oil depots, Tehran oil refinery, So these are things that are obviously designed to cause trouble for Iran domestically, interrupt energy supplies domestically. It's not a comprehensive attack. It's not a kind of Russian-style attempt to collapse the whole energy system in Iran yet. Who knows where that will go. I think these are more in the nature of a demonstration or a warning at the moment. But I think undoubtedly Israel will have the ability to do a lot more damage to Iran's energy infrastructure if it wishes to do so. But I think at the moment the intent is obviously is to put the onus on Iran for anything that happens internationally, for anything that interrupts global energy markets. So we'd say, I think at worst, let's say all of Iran's oil exports are cut off, whether that's because of physical damage to facilities or interruption of shipping or more US sanctions or whatever, right? That's got a maximum loss of 1.5 million barrels per day of oil exports. that is something that can be very easily covered by spare capacity in the UAE and Saudi Arabia and a few other places. So that is kind of not the big worry. Iran is quite a minor gas exporter. It sends a little bit of gas to Turkey, which Turkey could cover in other ways. It sends gas to Iraq, which is anyway going to be interrupted by US pressure. And again, Iraq, bad though that is for Iraq, it doesn't really affect the international market. Right. So I think the real question when we look internationally is, okay, how does Iran respond? And I can kind of see two cases there. In which Iran might respond against energy infrastructure. The one in which the regime is really comes under serious threat and decides that it has to take extreme measures to try and safeguard itself, and that it attacks energy infrastructure. And the other way is if there's a long drawn out Israeli campaign.
Hold on, let me stop you there. You say energy infrastructure, you mean in the Gulf Arab countries, I assume.
In the Gulf, yeah, in other countries, and with the Gulf Arab states being the obvious ones. I mean, of course, Iran will try to hit energy infrastructure in Israel. It's damaged the facilities, the Haifa refinery, but given the lack of accuracy of its attacks and the distance and so on, it's kind of unlikely, I suppose, that it does anything too crippling to Israel's own energy infrastructure. So we're really talking about softer and nearer targets. I'll get back to what those could be in a moment. But the other case I was drawing attention to is where these attacks by Israel draw on for weeks, if not months, and Iran concludes that we need some other strategic leverage to bring an end to this. We need a reason for Trump, let's say, to step in and say stop, and that is rising oil prices and inflation and all the economic troubles that come with that. And that's another case where they maybe take a decision to attack neighboring countries' energy infrastructure. And, they obviously have ways to do this. And you mentioned the Al-Qaeda attacks in 2019. The Ukrainians, of course, have demonstrated very well how this can be done with drones, very hard to defend against. And the Houthis have demonstrated also how even by threatening shipping, you don't have to sink very much. But even by threatening it, you can cut off a lot of shipping through a route and make things very difficult. And that would affect oil. No, that would affect the kind of 19 million barrels per day or so that comes out of the Gulf. And it would affect perhaps even more seriously gas, the 20% of global liquefied natural gas that comes out of the Gulf, mostly out of Qatar, at a time, of course, that Europe has lost Russian gas and is more dependent on the global energy market than ever.
Yeah, no, I think that's very helpful. And we'll come back to energy in a second. I just want to circle back around to Ali for a minute. So Ali, we were talking about the Iranian calculations, and I wanted to talk for a second about Israel's calculation. So I'm not sure we're in agreement given our conversations over the weekend about this. So I thought it was worth bringing up that my sense of the proximate cause for the timing of Israel's attack, I mean, stipulated that they've been planning this over a decade or two, and specifically preparing for it once the crippling of Hezbollah was secured in the late fall of last year, after the death of Hassan Nasrallah and the other key leaders and what have you. They start seriously thinking about a repetition in Iran of this kind of destruction from afar. But in my view, the proposal that the Trump administration was reportedly floating to Iran for a consortium with Gulf Arab countries that would have been aspirational and that would have allowed perhaps Trump to claim to Israel and to Israel's friends in the United States that Iran had given up the right to enrich in theory over the long run, and that sooner rather than later that would happen. And so the right, that Iran would stop enriching at some future point, but allow the Iranians to say that they will continue to enrich until such time as they decide not to by voluntarily joining a consortium or some similar way of squaring the circle on the right to enrich, that he'd come up with a potential formula that could, through some sort of diplomatic humbug or sleight of hand that all parties participate in, or at least the US and Iran participated in, find a way to accommodate both the right to enrich and the anti-right to enrich perspectives at the same time through an agreement, and that this was very alarming to the Israelis, that this suggested to them that the diplomatic situation could get out of their control very quickly, and that things could start spiraling towards Trump in a way that they could not prevent. And so that was one of the reasons they acted when they did. What do you make of that especially from the point of view of the regime, but also in general?
I find it, especially at this stage of the war, quite immaterial what triggered the Israeli preemptive action. As you yourself explained, I too believe that it was the destruction of Hezbollah a year ago. That was the beginning of the planning and the beginning of testing the Israeli bombardment of Tehran, and also taking out the senior leadership of the Revolutionary Guard, and possibly in the coming days also the political leadership. So what triggered it in reality, it really doesn't matter. It is a matter for historians. For us policy analysts, we find ourselves analyzing an ongoing war.
Okay, fair enough. All right, Kristin, how do you think the Gulf countries are perceiving Israel's role in this? How are they looking at the Israelis? You know, they had been perceiving Israel so far, generally speaking, as more of a stabilizing factor than a destabilizing one. And you were talking about the potential for a change. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure, like what I alluded to. I mean, I think there's been kind of a growing concern about Israel's regional posture. I already mentioned kind of what they've been doing both in Lebanon and also in Syria. Now, let's be clear. I think there was not a lot of sympathy for Hezbollah, so I think they were fine kind of in a way with Hezbollah being taken out by Israel. But the idea that Israel has kind of extended its posture, and then also within Syria, is a bit of a concern. And also, I mean, I did mention previously, but obviously in Gaza, the idea that, you know, they could be contemplating now, perhaps even you know, driving Palestinians out of Gaza, perhaps out of the West Bank as well. Obviously, that would be hugely destabilizing, most directly for Jordan and for Egypt, but this is something that I think all of the Gulf states think would be driving the region into, you know, another decade or two of destabilizing force within the overall region, was exactly what they don't want, as they're looking to become this sort of center of the global economy effectively, and really trying to position themselves as being at the technological forefront, and the trade kind of center as well of a new economy and a future economy. So I think there's just a lot more concern about where Israel is positioning itself in this particular government, I guess we could say. I mentioned before that I think the strategies that the different states have taken towards regionalization have varied a bit. We know that, of course, the UAE did make an agreement with Israel, the Abraham Accords, along with Bahrain. I think when they were looking at how they were going to be positioning themselves strategically, they saw Israel as a very powerful country, one that there could be enormous benefits from having greater cooperation, aligning themselves with in terms of technology as well as economic favor. So looking at sort of growing competition within this future-oriented scenario, you can see there are enormous benefits, as well as the kind of intelligence and security that Israel could offer against Iran, a problematic neighbor. I think Saudi Arabia never quite got there, and so their calculation has been a bit different. And I think Saudi, especially as a country that still sees itself as positioned and having an important role as an Arab and even an Islamic leader, of course, in a very new way, and also very much a regional leader, has turned quite a bit from that posture, and you know, has moved from a state that, you know, was contemplating normalization with Israel to now one that's really been trying to look to begin broader partners, that we were supposed to be having just this week, a UN summit with Saudi led with the French to effectively try to effectively look for a greater force to constrain Israel on the Palestinian issue, or to try to bring again a two-state solution, or at least greater protection for the Palestinians more to the forefront. So I think we can see some differences in how they've been perceiving the different weight of the powers in the region, and how they've aligned themselves with them. But I think for all of them, there's been great concern, I guess you could say, about the destabilizing impact of an Israel that is kind of perceived, at least, as having a more dominant position, especially as Iran drops. Then you have kind of a more dominant position by Israel.
I just want to say I received several notes that audience members couldn't hear me properly, and I hope that's been resolved. I changed some settings, and I hope that's okay now. And if it isn't, please let me know through the Q&A function, and I'll keep working on it. But I'm going to assume that it is. So thank you for that, Kristin. Very accurate. I believe the conference that has been postponed was also aimed at potentially organizing a critical mass in the international community led by France and others, and Arab states of Saudi Arabia, of course, to engineer unilateral recognitions of a Palestinian state by countries that haven't done it, especially in Europe. The countries that have been traditionally supportive of Israel, supportive of a two-state solution, but hesitant to recognize Palestine the way that, post-colonial countries in Asia and Africa, and even some in Latin America, have done in recent decades. That Europeans have hesitated to do that. They might have been moving towards doing that as part of a reaction towards the extremism of this Israeli government and threats to annex the West Bank, which many of these Israeli leaders have been openly boasting about. And that's, I think, another thing that is of great concern to Gulf countries, that could, prove to be very destabilizing, the region in general, of Jordan, potentially of Egypt, and of the whole situation in the Levant. Maybe not domestically in the Gulf, but just their interest in a calm, stable region would be further destabilized by that, in addition to what they see as an overreaction in Gaza, which has been destabilizing as well. So let's switch to the other side of the destabilization coin for a second, Ali, which is destabilization within Iran itself. To what extent has this conflict threatened the stability of the regime and seem to perhaps set loose forces inside Iran? Netanyahu has appealed to the brave people of Iran to rise up and what have you, but we know that there are armed minority groups on the periphery of Iranian society, but also a history of unrest within Iran itself, within the major cities and whatnot. So how does the ability of the regime to contain these threats or find them exacerbated by this conflict look to you?
Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel also urged the people of Gaza to rise against Hamas. But as we have seen, it is somewhat difficult to rise against your oppressor while you are being systematically bombed in your own home. And we have not seen any case of Iranians, the Iranian middle class, going to the streets protesting against the regime. The streets of Tehran are empty. People are seeking shelter from Israeli bombardments of civilian sites. This is the reality on the ground in Tehran. As for the provinces, we have yet to see armed uprisings and insurgency, but we have seen in the past significant terrorist insurgency activity both in the northwestern parts of Iran and in the southeast southeastern parts of Iran, meaning Sistan and Baluchistan province and Iran's Kurdistan province. These places, the most interesting and remarkable development that we have witnessed is that Israel is now bombing not only the nuclear sites or the launchers of ballistic missiles. No, Israel is also increasingly bombing armored divisions and regular garrisons in the northwestern parts of Iran, which tells me that we probably must await and expect an armed insurgency supported by Israel, at least in the northwestern parts of Iran, but a simultaneous uprising in...
You're speaking here about the Kurdish Northwest.
That is correct. And also a Baluchi...
Just to be clear about that. Yeah.
Armed insurgency in the southeast is also a distinct possibility.
That would be among the Baluchi.
That is correct. In case the Israeli Air Force is going to act in effect as the Air Force of the terrorist forces moving towards the capital, that would constitute a significant threat to the regime. But at the same time, it is also likely to throw Iran into a Yugoslavia-style war, Balkanization of Iran. Many of the people living side by side with Iranian Kurds are Iran's Azeri population. The Iranian Azeri population would be terrified of Kurdish forces advancing towards their homes and territories. Now, I am not expecting imminent collapse of the Islamic Republic, but I do expect that Israel has calculated with and is hoping to throw Iran into a civil war, a devastating civil war which weakens the central power in Iran and may at some point lead to some kind of a regime change. But we are far away from that right now. Right now, we are seeing a regime which has managed to bring itself, reorganize its forces. It has managed to stop getting assassinated, the assassination of top-level commanders of the Revolutionary Guard. We had only 2 yesterday, which means that the regime is much more careful. The element of surprise is no longer there to help Israel. So Iran is responding somewhat rationally to the crisis, and I'm not seeing any threat of imminent collapse of the state. So in many respects, the current situation in Iran resembles Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the 1990s. Bombardments from above, sanctions, crippling sanctions, but at the same time, and beginnings of a civil war, but at the same time, the regime survives, as long as there's no ground invasion of Iran.
It proved quite manageable for Saddam in terms of retaining domestic political power. So that, ought to encourage the regime to some extent. Robin, the United States or the Trump, let's say the Trump administration, is very sensitive to, the external economic pressure. It doesn't like to feel under external economic pressure. It reacts very badly to that. Trump personally reacts very badly to that. So to what extent might the Iranians look towards, raising the costs in terms of energy production, energy pricing, energy distribution as a means of leveraging American intervention in this conflict to restrain Israel? How do you think that could work?
Yeah, I think that's, is one of the few sources of leverage that you can identify for Iran. Obviously, nothing has stopped the Israeli campaign in Gaza. So unlikely that anything's likely to stop the Israeli campaign in Iran either, as long as logistically they can keep it up. So I think, yes, Iran absolutely will look for what are the sources of leverage it has. One source of leverage is obviously to try to advance the nuclear program in some way, in other sites covertly, however they do that. And the other way is, as you say, to try to push up global energy prices. And they have, the tools that they have against that would have to be directed against their Gulf Arab neighbors, because that's the major oil and gas production sites and transit routes that they could affect. Of course, Iran's own oil exports are likely to cut off in that scenario. So that's why I kind of described it earlier as a something of a last resort, or a case where the regime feels it's really in trouble, or where fighting has dragged on so long and there's so much damage being done to Iran that they feel they need a way out. But obviously we've seen the drone attacks on oil and gas facilities that presumably could be repeated. We could see attacks on shipping, threats to shipping through drones, missiles, and mines. The Houthis have shown that that's not easy to counter. The US basically kind of gave up trying to counter that. Iran's threat to shipping, I think, is more conventional than the Houthis, and maybe easier to target, easier to tackle for the US. US naval forces are on the way, of course, but the Iranians over time will learn, and if their initial attempts are not successful, they would, I'm sure, develop other ways of threatening shipping and energy infrastructure, just as the Ukrainians have. There's a lot of learning there of smart ways with quite limited resources to cause a lot of disruption to a well-armed opponent. And then, as you say,
no, go ahead.
Well, as I said, but then you have something like the scenario of 1990s Iraq, but a more active threat where you have a dangerous and unstable regime which is threatening to its neighbors, but which can't be overthrown by any means short of a direct invasion.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, you make you contrast the Iranian threat to shipping with the Houthi threat to shipping, but I want to throw this to both Ali and you, Robin, first. To what extent is it reasonable to see the Houthis as entirely separate from Iran in terms of threat to shipping? There is a school of thought that holds that the Houthi threat to maritime security is an extension of Iran's sort of grand strategy and regional strategy. How do you see that? And I'd like Ali's perspective on that as well.
Well, I think there's a domestic Yemeni context to this as well, of course, and the Houthis have their own objectives. But yes, obviously they're in fact allied with Iran, supplied by Iran, advised by them, and aligned with them in what they do to a significant extent. But I think that flows the other way as well. I'm no doubt the Iranians have learned a lot from the way the Houthis have carried out this campaign, and have things that they could apply themselves if they want to launch a similar campaign themselves. And I think also we should say that those threats to the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz run in parallel. They're reinforcing. So, for example, if the Saudis can't use the Strait of Hormuz, they can use their bypass pipeline to the Red Sea. That carries some 5 million barrels per day potentially. But if the Red Sea is also cut off, then that oil can only go north to Europe, not south to Asia, which is not very convenient. So, and I think that's an example of something I've pointed to before. That we've seen over the past few years a series of threats to global energy security. The Red Sea being one, the Russia-Ukraine war being another, and each of these is the world kind of manages and says, well, that wasn't too bad. We found a way around it. But the more simultaneous crises and threats you have, the greater the risk that the whole system just falls apart.
Sure. Ali, what do you think?
Ever since the near destruction of Hezbollah in Lebanon, we have seen the rise of the importance of the Ansar Allah in Yemen as an asset for the Islamic Republic. But I'm sure that exactly because of the reason that there is also an indigenous Houthi leadership making decisions and also thinking about its own survival, they may at some point reach the same conclusion as the leadership of Hezbollah today, which is to stay out of certain conflicts in order to secure their own survivals. They would not be willing to go down if the Islamic Republic also goes down. So how the situation evolves with the Islamic Republic in Tehran is obviously also going to impact the leadership decision-making process among Ansar Allah. As for the nuclear issue and Iran's motives for pursuing a nuclear deterrence, I do believe that the government of Israel, by disrupting nuclear negotiations between Iran and the United States, by staging a preemptive attack against Iran, is actually making the argument for the Iranian government and also increasingly to the Iranian public that a regional power with the size of Iran is in need of a nuclear deterrent. And the message, I believe, also is even beyond Iran. Today, I was accidentally discovered an article written by a friend of mine and a former colleague at American Enterprise Institute. The title of the article is "The war with Iran is a dry test of the war against Turkey." Imagine, if this is the case, we will be seeing more regional powers pursuing a nuclear deterrence, just like Iran is now in need of one. Why should Turkey or Saudi Arabia wait until a preemptive attack? So I do believe that the government of Israel, with this action, with the preemptive attack, is making the case for the further spread of nuclear weapons and is emphasizing the need among regional powers to pursue a nuclear weapon strategy.
I want to come back to that in a second, Ali, but I wanted to turn to Kristin and sort of picking up where Ali left off. So the Gulf countries really were united in wanting Tehran and Washington to come to terms on a nuclear agreement. I don't think they cared that much what the details were, as long as it made a direct conflict between any of these parties, US, Israel, Iran, more likely, and threatened their enjoyment of a secure and stable neighborhood where they could funnel their resources towards their actual imperatives, which are, as you said, economic and social and what have you. So what does that do potentially with the US playing an ambiguous role here, striking an ambivalent pose and creating an ambiguous relationship to the war? What does that do to the way the various Gulf countries look at the United States as a security partner, and how they view does this do anything to change the way they view relations with Washington or Washington's role in the region?
Well, I think kind of this game is still being played out right now. And it's probably, we're getting to kind of that critical stage, because I think when we look at where the current war is headed, as Ali said, Israel made really oppressive strikes in the very beginning of the war, hugely damaging to the Islamic Republic and its military leadership. But they haven't been able, at least from all the reporting, and perhaps can't on their own, make that kind of critical strike on the nuclear facilities. For that, they really do need the United States. So it seems to me that's the big persuasion that's trying to go on right now, where where Israel is trying to really bring the United States into the war. Like, look, this prime opportunity, it's here for you. The skies are open. Come and do this critical strike on Iran's file. So I think there's that, but there's also the question of the Trump administration and how they would like to play this. And there's at least some indication that they think that they could play more of a middle ground now, and use basically, I mean, Israel's also, at the same way they've shown strength, they're kind of like, where do they get out of this war? Like, how do they end this war at this point?
Right.
How much more damage can they do? Obviously, they can do a lot more damage, but is it going to be towards that critical issue? Are they going to leave Iran at some point just heavily wounded, but still with the nuclear threat? That's kind of a nightmare scenario, I think, for everybody. So I think probably the Gulf states as well would really like to see this come down to a negotiated situation now, where the Trump administration can use that leverage and pressure that's been created by Israel, but also to help Israel get out of this war, find a way out of the war. Likewise for Iran, to negotiate again on that nuclear file and again take that off the table. Then we would have a weakened but not completely overthrown Iran, some agreement on the nuclear file. I think, at least from the Gulf state perspective, that's a situation that would be more kind of manageable for them kind of moving forward. I think this threat of the nuclear file still being unresolved out there is deeply problematic.
Yeah. So Ali, let me circle back to you for a second on that. Where does this leave, especially from the point of view of the Iranian regime, but in general, the talks that were going on with the United States, both Washington and Iran are leaving the door open to resume negotiations in the foreseeable future. At the same time, it's going to become increasingly difficult to view the U.S. as this conflict goes on, to cast the U.S. credibly as a third party rather than implicated in Israel's attack on Iran, or at least the war that Israel is having with Iran, as the U.S. becomes, drawn into at least a supporting role, which appears to me very likely, or at least the Israelis will be demanding it and insisting on it and what have you. So it's rather tricky, is it not? And how do you think this is shaping up from various different perspectives?
Dr. Arakchi has indeed indicated that the Islamic Republic will be negotiating with the United States. I'm not sure that Iran will be negotiating as long as the bombardment of Iran is continuing. Negotiating under bombardment is a rather difficult task, for any government. But I'm also expecting Iran to recalibrate its demands and its posture and negotiation position, depending on what really remains of the nuclear program. I am not familiar with, I do not have technical insight with regard to how much of the program has been degraded, how much has been completely taken out, and what Iran can realistically do. But I do believe that the Iranian leadership, and increasingly also the Iranian public, fundamentally believes that the Islamic Republic's argument, and even the Shah's attempt to build a nuclear weapon, was the correct decision. Iran needs such a bomb in order to prevent and in order to deter future attacks like the one going on. What those terms of negotiations will be will also depend on how threatened the regime perceives itself. If it is on the verge of collapse, then it will take one negotiating position. If it is managing to control the crisis within the country and there is no real opposition to the regime or no real threat to the existence of the regime, the negotiation position of the regime will be much different.
Do you believe that the regime was interested in seriously considering the consortium idea as an aspirational, agreement that would not be realized in practice unless and until they decided to participate in it and could come to an agreement with regional countries?
So I think in your previous comments, you said that it was a fig leaf, a solution which would
I do think that,
not
yeah.
realize, and everybody would be happy with such a solution. And yes, I believe that that would be a perfectly good solution from Iran's point of view. Yes.
Okay, so that makes me even more convinced that it was indeed the proximate cause for Israel's actions. I want to remind everybody that you can join our conversation through the Q&A function. Please send your questions in to our panel, and I will forward them along. And there's the question that Philip Frayne has asked us is, Trump knew about the strike before it happened. He said so. He ordered the drawdown of non-essential personnel at embassies and bases in the Gulf, and signaled, therefore, the possibility of an Iranian attack, an Israeli attack on Iran. And why did the Iranians not understand this and move their nuclear scientists and top military leaders into bunkers? Why were they taken so surprised by this? I guess that's a question for you, Ali, but any of the three of you are welcome to chime in. I certainly don't know.
I believe this demonstrates the ineptitude of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, and the incompetence of the leadership of the Revolutionary Guard, which constantly underestimated the risk of Israeli sabotage of the nuclear talks. They were not expecting an Israeli preemptive attack as long as Iran was engaged in negotiations with the United States. And the President of the United States was constantly reporting, and so Mr. Witkoff, his Middle East envoy, that there was progress in the talks. So they underestimated the threat, and they paid a very, very heavy price for their incompetence and misjudgment. I believe that had Iran a different leadership and an individual both capable of engaging in the necessary diplomatic compromises at the negotiation table, but also capable of running a country under war, the performance of the regime would have been much better. And there is such a leader. There actually is such a leader in Iran today. And that person is former President Hassan Rouhani. Dr. Rouhani served as Deputy Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief throughout the Iran-Iraq War. He is the longest-serving National Security Council Secretary of Iran. This person is capable both of understanding international politics and the need for negotiations and need for compromise, but also an individual who is capable of running a country under war. So under these circumstances, the greatest service that the government of Israel can do to the Islamic Republic is actually by assassinating Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Yeah, they probably don't see it that way, but I mean, the Iranian regime probably doesn't view it that way, but that's certainly a very hard-headed analytical point of view. So thank you for that. Alejandra Galindo asks, what about the role of Qatar? And I'd like both Robin, you from the point of view of energy and Qatar's regional role, and you, Kristin, to look at it from both those points of view, also more the second. Let's start with Robin. What about Qatar's role in all of this? You mentioned LNG a couple of times, but if you could be a little bit more specific, they also do share the South Parts North Field, whatever, slash North Field with Iran there. Entire national income basically comes from this cooperative zone with the Iranians, and this kind of instability is really not good from a Qatari point of view. Moreover, there's the Al Udeid base, which is the biggest U.S. military footprint in the region and also the biggest target for those who would target American resources. So what do you think?
You're muted, Robin.
You're still muted, Robin.
One of the Israeli attacks was on the part of the facilities, the South Pars field, but the onshore part, so well away from the offshore where it's shared with the Qataris.
Yeah.
The Qataris, I think as Kristin has said, like the other Gulf states, they want to stay out of this, and their relations with Iran have generally been quite reasonable. And South Pars, North Field is part of the reason for that. They know that their national wealth is there, and they don't want it to get into trouble. So, well understood, they want to stay out of this. Now, if we come to the stage that Iran gets desperate and decides to lash out, it's a question what targets they go after. We've talked about oil, of course, and whether that would be the Saudis or the UAE or somebody else. But gas is, if anything, perhaps a greater vulnerability for the world, and certainly for Europe. Not so for the US, though. It wouldn't particularly hurt the US.
Because of a smaller number of suppliers?
Yeah, because Europe has lost Russian supplies, since 2022, and has now had measures to take out the last remaining part of Russian gas supply to Europe. So it's very dependent on LNG. It gets most of the majority of that from the US now. But if Qatari LNG is interrupted or diminished in any way, and China in particular and India and others are not getting it, they have to find alternatives from the global market. That'll mean very serious competition. Prices go through the roof, and a very real risk of shortages, or some, being forced into some uncomfortable diplomatic compromises with Russia. So, either way, not a good story for Europe. No. The US wouldn't be so directly affected as it's a major gas exporter. If anything, it would kind of in the short term, it would do better. So that isn't kind of a great way for the Iranians to bring leverage on the US, but it is perhaps a good way to bring leverage on the Europeans and the Chinese, and if any of those are going to help Iran out in this case. But again, same vulnerabilities as for oil. I think the gas facilities are out there in the middle of the sea. The tankers are there, and they are certainly very vulnerable to any kind of interruption.
Yeah. Kristin?
Well, I think you kind of noted a lot of the key factors, but it's worth just looking historically that Qatar has been very active diplomatically in trying to generate more mediation with Iran. I think they've always had a lot of active kind of track to conversations going on, trying to bring the Gulf states more into a position where they're, to move away from kind of the hawks against Iran. They've always been sort of a dove on Iran. And also the United States getting them to have a kind of negotiated settlement with Iran. So that's always been their posture. I think you've given the reasons quite well, or Robin has. Obviously, there's a lot of threats on them directly in their interests. It is very interesting, and part of that just complexity always of Qatar's position, that it is obviously the home base of CENTCOM. So, if we're looking at the US being involved, the fact that, if Qatar is trying to stop the US from using their base there, that's very problematic for the relation with the United States. But obviously allowing the US to be striking on Iran is also deeply problematic for their posture. So you always do see this kind of thing with Qatar, where they're trying to balance a lot of strong interests, stay on a very good side with the United States, which they have, at least on the military side, had excellent relations with the United States, while trying to secure kind of a peaceful landing for all of this. So it's a very tricky, obviously, moment for the Qataris, as it is for most of the Gulf states right now.
Yeah. I'm going to take this question quickly. Elaine Gringsby wants to know if Iran would be capable of producing a tactical nuclear weapon quick resist to the Israeli attack. Everything we know suggests no. So I think we can, I can just go ahead and dispense with that. I think that's very much not on the cards. Would any U.S.-Iranian deal, Lawrence Silverman asks us, include a cutoff of Iranian material support for the Houthis? And let me stretch that out to say, what about just limitations on Iranian support for the Houthis, for Hezbollah, for the Hashd Sha'bi groups, the PMF groups in Iraq, etc.? Begin with Ali, but anyone else who wants to join in on that, more than welcome.
My answer is quite short. Iran's proxy strategy has failed. The proxy strategy worked for Iran from the beginning of the 1960s under the Shah until the September of 2024, when Israel destroyed Lebanese Hezbollah. And once a strategy, a pillar of your national security collapses, you don't try to rebuild it. And I'm not even sure that a future Iranian regime would have the resources to dedicate fostering and building upon these kind of failed projects. The Iranian state will concentrate its efforts in one field, as I see it, and it is to attend to the only remaining pillar in its national defense strategy, and that is the nuclear program. If the Iranian regime survives, and by the way, any other future regime ruling Iran will be pursuing a nuclear weapon strategy in order to deter future attacks against the country.
Quick question, Ali, as a follow-up before we bring in anybody else. Does that mean that the regime is not going to be interested in a deal restricting that for a period of time with the United States?
Absolutely. The Ansar Allah of Yemen constitute a very, very cheap bargain.
No. Let me rephrase. That the regime in Iran is not going to be interested in a deal restricting the nuclear program with the United States for, say, 20 years or something like that, that another JCPOA would not be in their interests. But given what you just said, it leads one to jump to the conclusion they would simply not be interested in those in such an agreement. I'm not sure that's true. What do you think?
Another JCPOA would be wonderful from the point of view of the Islamic Republic, but another JCPOA is not what the United States is offering Iran. What the United States is pursuing right now, at least, the original position was, yes, some kind of a second generation JCPOA in which the Islamic Republic retains the right to enrich uranium on its sovereign territory. But that is no longer on the table. The United States government has said again and again that the U.S. does not accept any kind of uranium enrichment on Iranian soil.
When do you date that? Well, hold on. When do you date that?
Hussein, you asked me a question. Please give me the opportunity.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just confused. Okay, go ahead.
If Iran's response will depend on the state of Iran's nuclear industry. How much of it has been bombed? How much of it is operational? How much of it can Iranian leadership meaningfully use in the short or medium term in order to do something with it, to defend the country? And that is, first part. And the second part is how close the regime leadership believes that the regime is to complete collapse and surrender. The closer they are more willing to engage in negotiations and in making compromises.
Yeah. When do you date that that position of being unwilling to tolerate any enrichment at all from Iran? When do you date the American position?
The American position shifted, I would say, 2 weeks prior to 2 weeks ago, actually. It was two weeks ago. So it is in the course of the past couple of weeks that we saw Israel pressing ahead and perhaps persuading President Trump or someone in the Trump administration that it was possible for the United States to engage and continue negotiating with Iran. And for every Israeli bomb landing in Tehran, Tehran's negotiation position would be softened. That is, I suspect, what the government of Israel managed to persuade President Trump and his administration about.
And do you think that in that regard they were misled? Or it's to be determined?
Clearly, Israel had a different calculation, and it is that it can engage in a much larger attack, not only limited to the nuclear facilities, but also to the military and possibly political leadership, and whatever economic infrastructure Iran has. Hoping that at some point the United States would also get sucked into a war against Iran. In such a calculation, which, by the way, makes perfectly good sense, it is strategically comprehensible what Prime Minister Netanyahu has done. Iran's economy would be degraded and the entire infrastructure of the country would be degraded in such a degree that Iran would not constitute a meaningful threat to Israel, at least for 2 decades, possibly more.
Kristin, do you have any thoughts about the Houthis? Robin, either of you? About Iran's relationship with the Houthis?
I defer somewhat to Ali on his thinking about Iran and how expendable they are to the Iranian project. So I concur with him. I would say that we have seen quite a bit of more strategic kind of autonomy in the thinking of the Houthis. I think they probably feel that they've been benefiting internally from their posture towards Israel and winning in the broader, I guess, Arab world. Plus, ideologically, they seem quite committed to that posture. So I'm not sure. It would just be a calculation how much getting cut off from Iran would obviously would debilitate their ability to keep that up. But I think we can't assume that the Houthis would just follow in line with anything that Iran is asking them to do. I don't think that's the case.
No, of course, definitely. Robin,
I would just I'd observe 2 things. First is that the fate of Hezbollah doesn't stand as a great advertisement for being a proxy force of the Iranians. I think if we talk about the Iranians trying to rebuild the axis of resistance at some future date, I wonder who's going to be keen to sign up for that project now. The Houthis have their own reasons to carry on down the road they're going, so that's that's a bit different. But the other point I'd make is, Houthis and Hezbollah are apart. The other place to look at is Iraq, and the PMF and the Iranian allies in Iraq. What happens there? And I think that's very important because that's obviously one potential battleground again between Iran and Israel. Israel has struck, and the US as well has struck various figures in Iraq over the time. But that's one area where Iran could do a lot of damage and a lot of damage to Western interests and energy interests at the cost of damaging an ally of its own. But it's also a place that Israel, of course, might seek to strike Iranian allied forces, or the US also might. And there's a question there again. At some point, do the PMF members and the Iran aligned political parties think save their own skins and try and move away from the Iranian alliance and protect themselves?
And both Israel and the United States have struck inside Iraq in the past, so it certainly wouldn't be unprecedented. All right, another follow-up for you from Maricela Betancourt. Robin, what role could Venezuela play in global security, energy security, if all of this destabilization comes to pass?
Well, this really brings us to the question of, oil in particular and spare oil capacity. And if there's an interruption from oil from the Gulf in particular, then you lose the spare capacity, obviously, of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, and so on. Who else can replace that? Venezuela, to a limited extent, if the US saw a crisis and decided to ease sanctions on Venezuela to get some more oil on the market, there's a few 100,000 barrels a day, perhaps, that might come out, but not enough to really help us much in a crisis. Venezuela would need, years and tens of billions of dollars to get back to where it was in the early 2000s as an oil producer, and that really means a whole change in policy by the US towards Venezuela and a whole change in the attitude of the Venezuelan government and so on. So that's I think at the moment a long way off. And if we were to speak about who else could try and fill that gap, the US itself, of course, could step up oil production in a crisis, but again, only to a limited extent and only given a bit of a lead time. It couldn't fill a gap of several million barrels per day. So when you look at the spare capacity figures, they look fine on the face of it, but then you think what scenarios would arise that would cause us to lose that spare capacity, and you discover that very few people outside the Gulf have really any spare barrels at all.
Right. That's very helpful. Ali, I'm going to conflate two questions for you because they kind of overlap. One is that, somebody says, all right, if Iranians are worried about being attacked and invaded and they want a deterrent, wouldn't giving up a nuclear program remove one of the reasons for them being attacked, potentially? And so, which comes first? And then the similar one, or the kind of parallel one, was another questioner who wanted to know about wouldn't Iran have done itself a favor by stopping threatening the destruction of Israel on a routine basis, and hasn't that played into the hands of the Israelis and all of that? And it seems to be a good point.
We have a very good and well-educated and well-reasoned audience here at AGSI. Yes, absolutely.
Don't we? Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is why I believe that the 36 years that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has been the leader of the Islamic has been a disaster for Iran. Even if you look at the first decade of the Islamic Republic, from 1979 until 1988-89, the Islamic Republic and Israel had perfectly good relations. The two countries under Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, were tactical allies against Iraq, which posed a threat both to Iran and to Israel. Israel was the largest provider and exporter of American arms and American spare parts for the Iranian military. So there was no ideological enmity between the two. It was actually some kind of a camouflage for the cooperation between Iran and Israel. Iraqi intelligence officers and Iraqi propaganda machinery tried to tell the entire world that Khomeini and the Islamic Republic are secret allies of Israel, but nobody would believe this because it was so hard to believe that burning of the Israeli flag in Iran actually was just some kind of a political happening and a theater. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei thought he could do the same thing, but by 1990, 1991, the entire dynamic in the Middle East region changed. Iraq no longer, after the Kuwait War, no longer constituted a serious threat to Israel. Iran did. Iran was emerging as the most important Middle Eastern power. And around that time, Israel began weakening the Islamic Republic. Israel shifted, but Iran continued its silly propaganda warfare, hoping it could gain the leadership of the so-called Islamic world by promising destruction of Israel. And instead, what we have seen is destruction of Tehran in the hands of the government of Israel. This is why I believe that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has been completely inept in his leadership throughout 36 years. Now, as for capitulation of Iran's nuclear program, here I do believe that the regime has a very good argument. What they're saying is that the government of Muammar Gaddafi, that regime made an agreement with the United States, capitulated its nuclear program, but as soon as there were popular uprisings against the Libyan regime under the Arab Spring, the United States Air Force and NATO members, they provided air cover to Libyan rebels and see where Libya is. So at this point, and from this point onwards, the Islamic Republic knew that it could not afford to give up its nuclear capabilities, to surrender its nuclear capabilities. So in some ways, I think it is understandable that they were somewhat intransigent at the negotiation table, but at the other time, at other hand, they were also not militarily prepared to counter what Israel had in store for them.
Okay, thank you. David Wolf asks me directly, Ibish, do you believe that the UAE government could act as an effective interloper by suggesting to Iran that of the 1-3 agreement the UAE has, which does not permit domestic reprocessing and enrichment, would be helpful in lowering the temperature in the region? I have to say the answer, in my view, is no, because it doesn't even work for Saudi Arabia, which wants to mine its own uranium. It's certainly not going to work for Iran, which wants to at least maintain the fiction of the practical ability to continue to enrich, even if it agreed theoretically to give that up under this consortium idea or some version of that in the future. I think 1-2-3 is right off the table for not just for Saudi Arabia, but even more for Iran. So I say the answer to that is no. Robin, do you have any thoughts on that from an energy perspective? And either of the two of you, Kristin and Ali, can jump in.
Yeah, I agree, because the 1-2-3 agreement is about civil nuclear cooperation with the US. So is the US willing to now have civil nuclear cooperation with Iran and actually help them build nuclear power in return for not enriching? That seems like a huge concession by the US, and something that's going to be domestically in the US, I imagine, completely unacceptable.
The answer to that is no. Yeah.
Yeah.
Either of you, Ali or Kristin, want to jump in on that one?
No, you've covered it.
Okay. All right, so we have a question from John Mulholland, and I throw this open to everybody. What are the implications for Israel assuming another military front? How would the Israelis deal with that, do you think? Kristin? You seem like you wanted to, yeah.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, I think as Hussein and Ali have stated, I mean, I think this has been in the works at least since they were able to take out Hezbollah. I think Iran is the main strategic threat to Israel, always kind of the source of what they see is a lot of these other parties that threaten them. So in some ways, I guess we could see this coming. They've been threatening it for a long time.
Yeah.
The implications we don't know yet fully, because it depends how things sort of work out at the end of this conflict, which we're not really anywhere towards that. I think there are a lot of ways this could go even more definitely more damaging. We have seen Israel take some hits. I think I've seen the Israeli officials say that they're not more than what they expected, but that doesn't mean that there's not real pain in what Israel is sustaining by these missiles. And I think there are questions still about Iran so far, and I'm sure the Gulf states are thrilled with this, have been centering their fire on Israel. But there is that question that as they use up more of their missiles, especially their long-range missiles, and are just left with short-range ones, and they're running out of ways to kind of change the calculations of the global community and of Israel, there are possibilities that Iran could start targeting differently. And I think we've already kind of mapped out some of those, what they could look like in terms of hitting global energy or even going after the US or going after, interests of the Gulf states. So yeah, it kind of depends on how all of this plays out. But I think, obviously if they can get out of this with Iran degraded and in some sort of agreement where they're reduced and you can restrain to some stability, I guess we could see that as a positive outcome. But if it results in a situation where Israel is pushing so far that it's seen as really bringing on very grave consequences for the rest of the region by the reaction of Iran, then obviously that's not going to be well perceived, at least by the states in the region.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions about the debate in the United States and the Trump administration, and I'm wondering who wants to address that. What are the groups and individuals who seem to have Trump's ear on this? And the other tweak is, what are some of the U.S. Domestic and economic considerations as Israel pushes for the U.S. to finish the job and clean up any mess? So those are two overlapping questions, and I'd like to ask all three of you to address that, and then we'll close up with a final question from me to all of you.
So I believe that the Israeli planning has no clearly stated goal. And I think the goal is evolving as the campaign is moving forward. In the beginning, it appeared to be limited only to the nuclear program. Then we have seen some indication that changing the regime is the objective of the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And as he is calling for Iranian to rise up against the regime, and as we have seen propaganda warfare by representatives of ethnic minorities, but also terrorist groups, fundamentally in Iran's periphery regions, fragmentation of Iran may be the final objective of the Prime Minister of Israel. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu cannot achieve all of these objectives on his own. So he's also trying to entangle the United States in such a war. And that is obviously something which is going to be debated and contested in Washington, because one of the promises of President Trump throughout the years has been not to entangle the United States in forever wars in the Middle East. Now, is he going to remain true to his stated policy objective of keeping the United States out of the Middle Eastern mess? Or is he going to fall for the false promise of Prime Minister Netanyahu that this is going to be an easy war and Iranians are going to welcome US forces with flowers and garlands? Now, this is the debate which is taking place in Washington, and I'm sure that there are different groups debating these things, and there are very real policy differences. We have seen tendencies where President Trump agrees with the latest individual advising him. But on the other hand, we have also seen some degree of consistency in the statements of President Trump. One of them was that of his hope, his vision for global peace, and the other, the one that is, he is not going to entangle the United States in another forever war. We will see which group is going to win.
Kristin?
I mean, I just agree with that and just underline it that it is a very interesting fact that this sharply divides the Trump coalition. I think there's very strong opinions within the Trump coalition in both directions that think that this is a prime opportunity to take out the nuclear weapons in Iran, and we should go for that. And a very strong contingent, maybe in the ascendancy, actually, which is interesting at this moment in the Trump administration, that's kind of the more America first. We don't want to be pulled into this that Ali described, but that they're very, very sharply going after each other, even within the Trump constituency. So in that sense, it's kind of a dangerous issue for the Trump administration, which they may try to seek to neutralize, because anytime you have those kind of sharp disagreements, it can be very problematic for a political coalition. And I guess, Hussein, you're probably seeing the notice that was put up by Robert Rubin in the Q&A. You might want to look at that as well and bring that into the end.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of did cover it, but yeah, I mean, if you had thoughts on that, go right ahead, right now, go for it.
Oh, he just mentioned that we are getting reporting that Iran has been urgently signaling that it's trying to seek an end to hostilities and resumption of talks over its program, sending messages to Israel and the US via Arab intermediaries. I think that goes quite in line with a lot of what we were discussing, that that's probably the direction that I know the Arab governments would like to see, the Gulf governments would like to see. As I just mentioned, perhaps that'll be very attractive. That seemed to be the Trump administration's choice, was to use the leverage that Israel has given them to actually bring this to a peaceful negotiation that would sort of end this without the US having to get more deeply involved. And it looks like that's the Iranian preference right now as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So that could happen, but there are many forces here and in Israel and possibly elsewhere that have a different idea in mind. Robin, do you have any thoughts on the U.S. domestic debate before we wrap up with a final question for everybody?
Just the one observation that I would add is, I think, look, the Israelis and Netanyahu in particular went into this without a clear plan. I mean, the stated objectives don't make a lot of sense, don't have the capacity to destroy the nuclear program, and nor to bring down the regime, whatever propaganda is put out there. And the intention is clearly to bring the US in, and to back the US into a corner and try to bring it in. And there's plenty of people in the US who would like to do that, and others who are unwilling to do so. But a halfway house where there's a lot of damage to Iran, and Iran is furious, and a new generation of maybe more competent leaders comes into power, bent on revenge, but willing to lie low for a bit, and with the nuclear program still largely untouched. That's a worst case outcome for Israel if the US does indeed listen to these Iranian approaches. Otherwise, but then the alternative is the US comes in a much more active way, which is equally unwise. So no really good options.
Right, I think that's right. And so, which brings us to the final question I want to throw out for each one of you individually, and we'll go around the table one more time, starting with Ali, then Kristin, and finally Robin. What would you advise from your sectoral and sort of regional expertise perspective? What would you tell people to look for in the next sort of week, or even less, few days to a week, to help guide people in knowing where things are going in this very volatile, very difficult to read situation? Help us out, help our viewers, give them some guideposts for what to look for. Begin with you, Ali.
The strategic indicators that I would be looking for is if Israel is capable of conducting more top-level assassinations among the military leadership, but also the political leadership in Iran. That is one of the indicators. The second indicator is any sign of ethnic uprising or armed insurgencies in Iran's peripheral regions. That's the second indicator. And the third indicator, obviously, is Iran's behavior towards the countries in the Persian Gulf. Is Iran and the Iranian leadership, are they so desperate, and do they feel so endangered that they feel compelled to engage in attacks against the regional oil infrastructure or not? So these are the three indicators that I would be paying attention to. But let me end my comments and my participation in today's program with with a different note. There has never been anti-Semitism in Iran. The people of Iran are not against the people of Israel. Iranians always pride themselves in the fact that Cyrus the Great liberated Jews from slavery in Babylon. But unfortunately, for every single Iranian civilian who is being killed under Israeli bombardment of civilian sites, and for every civilian Israeli killed in Israel, there will be growing mutual hatred between two people who are fundamentally not enemies. And I hope, and I do hope, that there will be a day when there will be a peace between these two countries, and we can go back to the era where Iranians prided themselves in liberating the Jews from slavery in Babylon.
Excellent. All right, Kristin, your final thoughts. Help us out.
I think I pretty much previewed mine in my last comment. I mean, for me, I'm trying to look for signals of the off-ramp. I think the Trump administration has been signaling quite strongly that they are, hoping that Iran will return and discuss things and be more amenable to the terms that the Trump administration had laid out. I think seeing this kind of reporting that Iran is in fact talking about doing that. I mean, I guess it's not fully clear if they're going to do that while there's still bombing going on, which they said previously they would not, and also whether they're willing to compromise, as Ali suggested, they probably would not be on their right to keep forgot the word for that, doing nuclear capability.
Right to enrich.
Yeah, on their own soil. But maybe they're more amenable right now at this critical period. So I think just sort of looking at those along with the things that Ali spoke about, where their pressure points kind of breaking inside Iran and what Israel might do in that scenario will be kind of what I'm watching for.
Yeah, I would think that the regime would have to be mortally threatened before there's a huge shift on the right to enrich. But Robin, your closing thoughts, give us some benchmarks.
Yes, I would just watch very carefully the progress of the Israeli campaign. Do they go after more Iranian energy targets or other kind of infrastructural targets, power plants, things like that? And conversely, does the Iranian regime start signaling that it would widen its retaliation, that energy facilities elsewhere in the Gulf, shipping, whatever, may come under threat, or any kind of signs of preparation for that? And I think then that also comes the signaling here that that the Iranians may be ready to negotiate. Are there then signals that, well, if you don't negotiate, then we have to defend ourselves, and we reserve the right to take all actions, or any kind of language like that, and implicit threats against other energy infrastructure.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Robin Mills, Kristin Diwan, and Ali Alfoneh, all from the Arab Gulf States Institute. And I'm Hussein Ibish. I'm a senior resident scholar here. Another great webinar. We will be doing this repeatedly as long as this most unwelcome conflict continues, and as long as we have to deal with fallout, which looks like it's going to be going on for a while. And then when that's over, other things will happen, and we will have no end of subjects. So join us next time for another great AGSI webinar. And thank you very much.